Clara Boone had only one crust of bread left, the kind a starving woman saves for herself. Yet she pressed it into the trembling hands of an old wanderer named Amos Reed, never expecting to see him again. But out on the frontier, small mercies can shake the earth. By sunrise, the sheriff rode to her door with news that stopped her breath. Amos was gone, and in his final will, the drifter she'd fed had left her something unimaginable. Every acre, every fence post, every sunrise on his vast and lonely ranch. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Clara Boone had learned the economy of silence and thrift long before winter taught her the cruelty of hunger. Widowed 2 years past, she measured days by what she could mend and evenings by what little warmth a single coal could give. And now her pantry held no more than a single hard crust of bread, the kind a woman saves for herself when the world has nothing to offer. And yet life on the outskirts of Dustwood had taught her that survival and decency sometimes pull at opposite ends of the same small rope. The little cabin she rented from a neighbor had a sagging roof and a hearth that smelled of soot and stubborn hope. She kept a photograph tucked in an apron pocket, her husband's hat stitched with a careful hand. And when the wind from the north came sharp and the sky looked like old iron, she told herself she would not beg, would not trade what was left of her dignity for alms. On a night when the stars were cold points and the lamp guttered low, there came a soft rap at her door, and the shape she let in was one the town rarely remembered fondly, a wanderer, thin as a windward branch, his coat threadbare, hands shook not from age alone but from the exhaustion of too many miles. His face had the map of bad years, his eyes were an odd, soft gray that had seen both cruelty and small mercies, and when he sank to the floor Clara saw the hollowness of hunger in the hollows of his cheeks. For a long moment she watched the man and measured the bread against her memory of easier summers, counted the weeks since a single coin had come across her palm, and felt the old argument rise, keep it and live a little longer, or give it and be the better kind of poor. The wind pressed its coldness into the cracks, and Clara felt something older than hunger, an ache that belonged to the forgotten laws of neighborliness, tilt her decision toward charity. She wrapped the crust in a scrap of cloth, the cloth that once held her wedding silver, and pressed it into the wanderer's rough palm. He took it like a man surprised by grace, and when he lifted his head his lips shaped a small, unexpected thank you that sounded like a bell in the quiet church. Kindness circles back, Miss Boone. Sometimes with a gallop, he said, his voice low as if the words had sailed through many storms before landing here. The sentence landed in her chest like a stone and made ripples she could not name. She wanted to ask his name, to anchor him to a place and a reason, but he only smiled with slow, tired sorrow and said names were heavy things to carry on the road. That night she watched him leave with the last of her bread cradled in his hands, a silhouette moving away from her lamplight into the dark that smelt of sage. Clara could not have known then that a single small mercy would tilt the ledger of fate. She could not yet imagine the way the sheriff's boots would sound on her porch at dawn, the way a town would gossip, or that her life, measured in pinched pennies and narrow horizons, would, because of one crust given with a calculation, be offered a wide, lonely expanse to steward. Still, as she scrubbed the pot until the metal sang and lay down with the ache of hunger folded into her bones, the wanderer's words kept rising in her like a promise or a warning, and she slept with the faint stir of a wind that seemed to whisper a coming change. Clara awoke to the rhythm of hooves that sounded like a question at her door, slow, purposeful, the kind that carried the sheriff's weight. And when she opened the door, Sheriff Eli Mercer stood there with his hat in his hands and the light of the new day cutting the edges of his face like a list of hard decisions. He was a man who carried law the way a rider carried his rifle, steady and unavoidable. And before she could offer coffee or a weary smile, he said, "Miss Boone, I'm sorry to wake you so early." And that quiet preface held the truth like a coiled rope. The words came out measured. Amos Reed had been found in his bed at the livery, no sign of foul play. The claim by the innkeeper that the wanderer had gone to sleep and simply not woken. Clara heard the sentence and felt a slow hollow open inside her, as if the small warmth of the previous night had been snatched away by the cold dawn. The sheriff's boots shifted, and he produced from his coat a folded scrap of paper, handwriting cramped and honest, dotted with crossings out and a tremor of ink that suggested a man writing with more heart than steadiness. He had a will, Eli said, and Clara's stomach took alerts that had nothing to do with hunger. The little house seemed to tilt as if the whole world had been asked to reconsider its axis. He read the brief lines aloud, and the sound of the words against the quiet was almost obscene in its gentleness. Amos Reed bequeathed the Reed Ranch to Clara Boone, every acre, fence, and dwelling, no conditions. Clara could feel the phrase lodge inside her like a stone, heavy and incongruous. She who had given away across the night before without expectation now found her name inked into the fade of acres she had never surveyed. For a moment she could only stand, the sheriff's outline moving in the doorway like a frame around an impossible painting, and ask, "Why me?" But the question splintered against him. Eli's face folded into a map of reasons he did not know and a duty he must carry. He shrugged with a softness that surprised her and said, "Only Amos can tell why, Miss Boone." He kept his secrets. The town woke in a rainbow. News travels faster than any horse and dust would when it involves land. By noon, neighbors had turned their chores into gossip, some offering congratulations with the thinness of those who must swallow their surprise, others looking at her with a suspicion that tastes like old coin. Mrs. Keene at the mercantile pressed a handkerchief into Clara's hand as if it could stitch together the generosity and the mystery, while Jed Hale spat accusations beneath his breath like a plow turning up roots of resentment. No drifter leaves a wrench for nothing. He muttered loud enough that a circle of listeners nodded like a chorus. Rumors bloomed like tumbleweed. Some said Amos owed a debt he could not refuse. Others whispered of a love lost long ago and a promise kept with the stubbornness of men who cannot forgive themselves. Clara felt the town's eyes weigh upon her as if her shoulders had become a ledger to be balanced. Her hunger and her sudden authority folded into one impossible ledger. She found herself walking the property line that afternoon, touching the wire, tracing the worn wood with fingers that smelled of bread and labor, trying to reconcile the rustic, solitary beauty of the land with the small cabin of her own life. Responsibility landed on her like weather, unasked for, real, and immediate. The sheriff helped with the legal part as best he could. He spoke of probating witnesses and promises to have the will examined by the clerk in the county seat, practicalities that sounded like a foreign language to a woman who measured wealth in days of food, not deeds. Yet beneath the shock was a kind of tide that moved her, an uneasy mixture of gratitude, suspicion, fear, and a strange bloom of purpose. Amos's name on paper had opened a door she had not dreamed to knock upon. And as the sun slid down and the town went about its evening chores while whispering still, Clara sat on the stoop and held the folded wool in her hands, feeling the paper's texture as if it had weighed enough to alter the course of everything she'd thought she knew about giving, about receiving, and about what it meant to be entrusted with another man's last thing. The road to the Reed Ranch unfolded like a story told in long, slow lines. Clara rode with Sheriff Eli Mercer at her side, the sheriff's horse plodding with the steadiness of a man who had seen many surprises and learned to meet them with a measured breath. And as they crested the final rise, the land rolled away in a sea of tall grass, the stalks bowing to the wind like a congregation taking a long, tired breath. There was the house, small against the broad sky, a weather-beaten cabin sitting with the patience of an old sentinel, fences rotted and leaning where storms had done their quiet work, and acres that seemed to breathe their own loneliness in the afternoon heat. Clara felt her chest pinch with a mix of awe and a strange, sliding disquiet. How could a man whose life had been that of a wanderer come to possess something so rooted? The Reed Ranch smelled of dried hay and sage, sun-warmed earth and the faint iron of old tools. It smelled of things Clara had used in passing but never called hers, gate latches that knew the hand of a single keeper, stalls that held the echo of hooves, a windmill that turned with small, dogged patience. Up close, the homestead told the story of steady maintenance, a fence mended here, a patch of well-tended soil there, but also the silence of one who lived alone. No children's toys, no clothes hung to dry, no basket by the door. Sheriff Eli moved through the yard with the courtesy of a man who knows grief must be met gently. He gave Clara room to take it in herself. Inside, the cabin held the hush of a life lived in quiet conversation with the land. A single rocking chair faced the window where the sun wood rise, its wood smoothed by long, solitary use, Maps were tacked to the wall, routes and names carefully inked, as if Amos had kept the world on paper to make some sense of it. And journals lay in a neat stack, their covers soft from hands that had returned to them often. Clara could almost read a rhythm in a scatter of objects: a tin cup, a blunt pencil, a boot with the sole worn thin by miles. In the corner a trunk sat with a padlock like a closed mouth, heavy, old, and resolutely private. Her fingers hovered over it and felt the chill of mystery. The lock resisted her curiosity like a stubborn old law. She ran a thumb along a page of a journal and found entries that sketched a life in fragments, names that hinted at places and people, a weathered apology to time, a gratitude for small graces that read like the footprints of a conscience. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes cramped as if written on a moving train of regret. He spoke of odd jobs, of towns where he'd slept under different stars, of saving for nothing in particular until one day he had come to know the quiet dignity of owning a bit of ground. There was an intimacy to the pages that pricked Clara. This man had lived inside his own thoughts, and sometimes those thoughts had been sharp with loneliness. The sheriff found a photograph tucked between pages, a woman whose face had been softened by years, a child peering forward with a shy hand on a knee. No names written, only a dried leaf pressed alongside as if to keep the memory from blowing away. Clara sat with the photograph, the light on her face making small lines in her eyes, and felt something open that had been closed inside her for a long while. The cabin, for all its solitude, felt like a room in the shape of a life waiting for its next breath. Outside, the ranch held its own questions. The fence lines suggested boundaries that begged for tending. The fields needed seeding and mowing, and the barn's shadow hinted at stories that had not yet been told. The trunk remained a quiet, locked promise, an open loop in a story that had already begun to tug at Clara's marrow. And as she closed the cabin door and let the sunlight fall like a benediction across the threshold, she felt the thing Yardley folk called destiny move not like a thunderclap but like a weather change, slow, inevitable, and carrying with it the sense that Amos Reed had left more than property behind. He had left an invitation, and perhaps a charge, to bring whatever had been unfinished to a gentle, human rest. News moves through dust wood, a way dry tinder catches a spark, quick, hungry, and with a small, terrible beauty. At first Clara found herself the recipient of cautious courtesies and awkward congratulations, hands extended that trembled between charity and curiosity. Mrs. Keene offering of pie she could not accept without feeling the town's eyes press against the thin pastry like judgments, and schoolchildren pointing with the blunt honesty of youth as their elders exchanged glances that weighed coin and character in the same breath. The mercantile became a theater of whispers, some voices soft with genuine relief that a good soul had been rewarded after so much hardship, others sharp with the acidic edge of suspicion. No drifter, the rumor went, gives away a ranch for pity's sake. There must be a clause tucked into the ink, a debt, an unpaid promise, something behind the sudden benevolence. Clara, carrying the folded will inside her bodice like a small, ridiculous talisman, felt the town split along lines she had never noticed before. Old alliances reminded, new grudges forged in the way folks look at a woman who steps into a role that used to belong only to men with pocketed law and practiced tenureship. Judge Hale, who ran a neighboring spread and whose joy had always been set to a permanent scowl at the sight of anyone prospering without his permission, took the suspicion and sharpened it into a campaign. He stood in the saloon with his hat low and said aloud for the bar to hear that no dead drifter leaves land for nothing, that there were always debts that needed settling. And when he named Amos Reed as a man who once owed him for work and seed in the soft currency of favors, his words fell into the ears of listeners like stones. Yet's voice carried more than accusation. It carried a promise, the kind that is easy to make in dusty rooms where men measure their self-worth by fence lines and cattle counts. That ranch ought to be mine, he muttered one morning where Clara could hear, and in that two-word sentence the town found an excuse to watch her differently, to test the seams of her courage. Clara had not come to Dustwood to command a paddockwood to argue legalities. She had come to keep a roof over her head and the memory of a man she loved tucked away like a warm stone. But she felt responsibility bloom in her chest like a stubborn weed. She met Jed once on the lane and asked him plainly, voice steady though her hands shook, "Why him and not you?" He spat his answer with a bitterness that smelled of old envy. "Because you were closer when he nursed his last bread," he said. laying down a claim that smelled more like ownership than justice. The sheriff tried to keep the peace, telling folks there'd be no hasty judgments until the probate clerk read the will and Amos's wishes were settled in law. But law moves slow in places where resentment runs fast, and threats flickered under the polite surface. An anonymous note nailed to Clara's barn that read, "Take what's yours, return what ain't," and a late-night horse that paced by her fence as if testing its new keeper. Clara wrestled with a moral pull that the journals in Amos's cabin had already hinted at. The waymen, starved for power, will bend narratives toward themselves, and the quieter truth that sometimes kindness is a greater threat to the world's ledger than any coin. She could have walked away, laid the will before the clerk, and let the dust settle on someone else's claim. Instead, she found herself answering gossip with steadiness she had not known she possessed, inviting the town's scorn to meet the fact that she had given food without thought for reward and received a gift that carried expectation. In the market, she kept her words short. When a neighbor asked if she feared losing the ranch, she said, simply, "I fear not tending what's been trusted to me." That line, modest, stubborn, did more to quiet some than any legal argument. Because in a place like Dustwood, character is currency and people listen when one acts the part they claim. Yet Jet's shadow remained. His cattle scratched at the same scrub that marked the Reed boundary, and every so often a fence post bore the mark of a boot meant to remind her that property is not only paper but muscle and menace. Through it all, Clara felt the shape of herself changing, not into a woman who sought revenge nor one who solicited pity, but into a steward who would have to learn both how to mend fence and how to mend a town's belief in the goodness of an unexpected inheritance. Clara moved into Amos's cabin on a morning that felt too quiet for such a life-faltering step. The sky washed in a pale gold that made the empty fields look like pages waiting for a story. She set her small bundle of belongings on the worn table and felt an unexpected tremor in her hands, as if the walls themselves were measuring her worthiness. The cabin smelled of cedar, old leather, and the faint ghost of pipe smoke, scents that belonged to Amos, lingering like unfinished sentences. And as she swept the floor with a broom that had seen better years, she felt the weight of ownership settle on her shoulders with the heavy certainty of a saddle she wasn't sure she could carry. The chores came at her like unfamiliar horses, hauling water from the pump, mending a fence whose boards splintered under her touch, trying to coax the stove into enough warmth to cook beans without scorching them. Each task seemed to whisper that she was an imposter living in the boots of a man who had known every corner of this land. Loneliness pressed into her at dusk when the wind slid through the chinks in the cabin, a soft, dragging voice that made the silence feel too large. She missed the easy companionship of her late husband's humming, missed the sound of neighbors close enough to call through thin walls, and now she heard only the stretch of wood in her own heartbeat as she sat before the hearth eating food that tasted of exhaustion and uncertainty. But the journals, stacked neatly where Amos had left them, pulled her in like lanterns in the dark, their pages soft and thinned by years of turning. She opened one after supper and read entries written with a voice that felt both fragile and stubborn, a man who traced his wandering through towns forgotten by maps, through hard winters and harder regrets, always circling the memory of a wife whose name he never wrote and a child he spoke of in careful, aching fragments. Clara traced the ink with her fingertip, feeling a strange intimacy with the man who had slept in the very chair she now sat beside, imagining him bent over those pages while coyotes called to the moon. In his words she sensed a restlessness that had eventually quieted into solitude, a sense that he was trying to leave something more behind than cattle and land, trying, perhaps, to pass on a burden or a blessing he'd carried too long alone. Some passages were short and sharp, others meandering like a man speaking aloud to keep loneliness from swallowing him whole. One line struck her harder than she expected. "I have walked long roads hoping someone might care enough to take what I no longer can finish." Clara read that sentence again and again, feeling as though the ink reached through years to tap her heart. She wondered if Amos had recognized something in her, an echo of grief, a stubbornness softened by kindness, a willingness to listen to his story even if she didn't yet know she was part of it. As the night deepened, she felt his presence not as a ghost but as a quiet urging, a gentle hand pointing her toward the locked trunk, the maps on the wall, the sunrise chair that seemed almost sacred in its placement. She slept poorly, waking often to the rustle of wind in the eaves and imagining Amos sitting in that rocking chair watching the dawn wash over the land. seeing in the light some secret he hoped she would unravel. And though she felt overwhelmed by the chores, the emptiness, the suspicious eyes of Dustwood, and the vastness of the ranch, there was a growing thread of connection that stitched her to Amos Reed's unfinished story, a sense that he had not chosen her out of chance but out of a strange, quiet recognition that two lost souls, separated by years and circumstance, might somehow finish the same long journey together. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The storm arrived without mercy, rolling over the plains in a dark wall of cloud that swallowed the horizon and bent the tall grass flat as if the earth itself were bowing under its weight. Clara had barely finished her morning chores when the first crack of thunder tore the sky open and sent the horses in the corral circling with panicked hooves, their cries sharp against the rising wind. Rain came next, hard, slanting sheets that stung her skin and blurred the world into streaks of gray, and she rushed to the cabin to shut the shutters, only to find water already seeping through the warped window frame and dripping onto the floor in relentless taps that matched the pounding in her chest. She stuffed rags into cracks, fought with a stubborn hinge that refused to close, and whispered breathless prayers that the roof, already tired from years of weather, would hold under the storm's violent weight. The wind keened around the corners of the cabin like something alive and grieving, lifting the edges of the shingles and slamming against the door as though demanding entry. Clara felt a strange kinship with its fury, as if the storm were echoing her own spiraling doubts. What business did she have tending a ranch, living in a dead man's home, carrying his legacy when she barely carried enough knowledge to mend a fence? A sudden crash from outside snapped her from her thoughts, and she ran through the downpour toward the barn where one section of the south fence had collapsed under the force of the wind, boards scattered, nails shining like broken teeth in the mud. She worked frantically, grabbing what wood she could find, her hands shaking as she tried to brace the fallen rails, all while the storm whipped at her dress and soaked her to the bone. Fear and determination tangled inside her as she battled the elements, as if the land itself were testing whether she would stand or break beneath its demands. When the worst of the gusts finally eased, she ducked into the barn, breathless, dripping, and trembling with exhaustion. The dim interior smelled of hay and wet earth, the lantern light flickering across the beams like a heartbeat. It was then, while searching for rope to secure a loose stall door, that she noticed a patch of wood on a support beam, smooth different from the rest, its surface worn by repeated touch. She stepped closer, brushing away dust until faint carved lines revealed themselves. AR+ER, the initials cut with the precision of someone who had carved not in passing but with care, maybe even reverence. A chill that had nothing to do with the storm prickled her skin. Amos Reed's initials were unmistakable, but ER. She whispered the combination into the barn shadows, half expecting an answer to drift down from the rafters. The journals had hinted at a lost family, at a sorrow heavy enough to shape a man's entire existence. But names had been scarce, always implied, never written outright. Was ER his wife? His child? A sister? Whoever it was, Amos had marked this place, this very beam, with a memory he couldn't let go, a piece of his heart carved where only he would see it each morning while tending the animals. Clara pressed her fingers to the grooves, feeling their depth, their intention, and something inside her shifted, a slow, steady pull toward understanding that this ranch was more than land, more than inheritance. It was a story left half told, a burden he hoped someone would lift, a truth he had carried in silence. The storm outside began to quiet, the thunder retreating into long, distant rumblings, and Clara felt the same easing in her chest, as though the violent clash between fear and responsibility had broken open something steadier within her. She gazed at the initials again, her heartbeat slowing into a rhythm that felt almost like purpose. Maybe she hadn't been chosen for her strength or her skill. Maybe Amos had seen in her the willingness to care, to listen, to carry forward a life's unfinished work. As the rain softened to a cold whisper on the barn roof, Clara realized the wrench was no longer simply a gift. It was a trust, and uncovering the truth behind those initials, behind Amos Reed himself, might be the calling she had never known she was meant to follow. The knock on the cabin door came just after sunrise, soft but insistent, the kind of knock carried by someone who had practiced gentleness for many years. Clara wiped the last of the dishwater from her hands and opened the door to find an elderly woman standing on the stoop, wrapped in a faded blue shawl and leaning on a cane polished smooth by time. Her eyes, sharp and silvery, studied Clara with a familiarity that made the younger woman straighten instinctively, and before Clara could speak, the stranger offered a small, weary smile. "You're Clara Boone," she said, her voice rasped by age yet steady as a hymn. "Name's Martha Keene. I reckon we ought to talk about Amos." The mention of his name struck Clara like a sudden change in wind. She stepped aside and let the woman in. Martha moved slowly across the floor, her gaze sweeping the cabin with a sort of recognition that suggested she had once known its former occupant well enough to understand its arrangement, its silences, even its worn rocking chair facing the window where the light pooled like an old memory. She lowered herself into the chair Amos favored, exhaling as though she had returned to a place she'd feared she might never see again. "I heard in town about the will," she said, folding her hands over the head of her cane. "And I knew I had to come before the stories get twisted into something they ain't." Clara felt a prickle of uneasy hope. Here was someone who might finally explain the puzzle Amos had left behind. So she offered tea, sat across from Martha, and listened. The elderly woman began her tale not with drama but with the patient cadence of someone unspooling a truth long kept taut. She told Clara that Amos Reed had not always been a man of property. He had once arrived in Dustwood with empty pockets and hollow cheeks, living off odd jobs and sleeping under whatever shelter the frontier offered. It was hard work, backbreaking, lonely work, that slowly rebuilt him into someone who could claim even a sliver of this land. But before that rebuilding, Martha said, her voice dipping low, there had been a life Amos never spoke of, a life swallowed by the harshness of the West. He had a family once, she said, glancing at the journals stacked neatly on the shelf. A wife named Eleanor, and a little girl, Rose. But the frontier, it ain't gentle. One winter they vanished. A sickness, a storm. The details changed dependent on how much whiskey he'd had. But the truth was simple. He couldn't save them. Clara felt the air thicken in her lungs, a sadness blooming through her chest as if she had touched Amos's grief through time. She thought of the initials carved in the barn, AR+ER, and the tenderness in each carved stroke made new sense. Martha went on, explaining that Amos had carried that failure like a stone in his saddlebag, weighing down every mile he walked. He spent the rest of his years trying to make something good out of what was left of him, she murmured. And he never let himself forget the cost of looking away from someone who needed help. Clara's hands tightened around her cup as she realized the depth of the man's wounds. Wounds he had stitched closed through labor, solitude, and remorse. Then Martha leaned forward, her gaze piercing through Clara as if she were reading the younger woman's soul. "He told me once," she said, "that if he ever found a soul kind enough to give without expectation, he'd set his burdens down in their care. I reckon your crust of bread did that for him. You reminded him of the good he once failed to protect." Clara's breath caught. The weight of those words settled on her like both blessing and burden. She had known Amos only a handful of minutes, yet Martha's story wrapped her into a past she had never witnessed, a grief she had not earned but now carried, woven tight with her own losses. She felt tethered to Amos in a way that transcended logic or time, as if their stories, two lives marked by loneliness, loss, and reluctant hope, had folded together on that cold night when a starving wanderer knocked on her door. And in that moment Clara understood that the ranch, the journals, the locked trunk, and even the wind that crossed these plains were part of a legacy Amos had entrusted not to chance but to the quiet courage he'd seen in her. Duskwood's quiet had always been threaded with small tensions, disputes over grazing rights, a barbed word thrown like a loop to test a neighbor's patience. But when Jed Hale set his jaw and began to speak against Clara Boone, the town's seams pulled taut as a drum. He stood in front of the general store one afternoon with his hat tipped low, voice carrying his grievance like a bell, and said plain enough that no drifter dies and leaves a wrench for nothing, that there were always obligations hidden in ink, and that Amos Reed had been a man who owed more than land could settle. His words found fertile ground among those who counted acres like salvation and measured a person's worth by the heft of their herds. Men who felt their own fortunes narrowing watched with interest as Jed painted a picture of a convenience, of a dead man's last breath used to hand a property to someone the town scarcely trusted. That painting hardened into action. Jed moved through town gathering a small but stubborn faction, men who had worked the land next to Amos's, women whose husbands had lost cattle to rustlers, folks who felt the economy's pinch and who saw in Clara's new ownership an affront to the natural order. They argued the ranch should be redistributed, split between neighbors who could make immediate use of its fields, and their rhetoric grew louder over weeks, until polite whispers at the post office became outright demands at the saloon counter. The pressure moved from talk to deed in the way it always does. A gate left unlatched, a fence rail pulled loose in the night, a stamp of a boot on a parcel of ground where Clara had planted a small patch of seed. Each act was a small test, an attempt to see whether the new owner would flinch or stand. Clara felt those tests like needles, sharp, repeated, and she began to measure her days in repairs and suspicion. Someone slit the canvas on a hay bale. Another night someone drove cattle too close to a newly repaired fence, forcing a frantic scramble in the rain to save a calf. The sheriff's presence calmed some tempers, but law moves slower than rumor, and when men move with the simple certainty of decades of advantage behind them, legalities can feel like a thin cloth against a hard wind. Yet for every hand raised against her, another quietly lifted in defense. People who knew Amos and knew his stubborn streak remembered that he would have resisted Judd Hale with every bone in his body. Mrs. Keene, who'd once loved Amos enough to speak softly of his losses, took Clara aside and supplied work hands to mend the worst of the fences. An old ranch hand named Tom Briggs, who'd once worked alongside Amos and owed him an old loyalty, came by at dawn with tools and a steady, wordless presence that settled Clara's nerves like a warm blanket. They argued that Amos had lived long enough to choose his end, that the will's ink was a monument to his autonomy, and that taking his land from the woman who had been kind to him would be a cruelty double down. The town divided visibly. Meals shared became cautious, neighborhood visits stopped being casual, and Clara felt the loneliness return with a new hardness, the feeling of being examined as if she were a specimen and not a steward. The moral question spread beyond simple legality into the territory of human character. Was this about property or about whether kindness should be rewarded or punished? Jet's followers said reward would set a dangerous precedent, that land should not be a prize for sentimental acts. Those who defended Clara insisted that the frontier's last true currency was decency, that Amos's choice reflected the grain of his conscience and deserved respect. In the middle of that current, Clara found herself learning a new kind of courage, one that had nothing to do with guns and everything to do with endurance. She stood in town meetings and listened, sometimes speaking, often holding back the anger that would make a bad bargain of her better self. When someone hissed that she had conned a dying man, she met the word with silence, because her truth was a simpler thing. She had fed a man and he had placed trust in her, and trust carried weight she did not seek to squander. The struggle pushed at the town's heart and exposed the wrong nerves beneath polite society. Fear of change, the ache of want, the brittle pride of men who measure themselves by acres. And in the end the conflict was less a single battle than a lasting test of what Dustwood would be. A place where the law and the moral law could stand together, or one where advantage swallowed kindness whole. Clara, who had once felt the world narrow to a crust of bread, now felt it widen into a moral field where fences had to be mended not only with nails but with patience, perseverance, and the slow work of proving a gift was given in earnest and deserved to be honored. Sheriff Eli came back on a late gray afternoon, the sun slanting like an apology through the clouds, and when he dismounted he carried not only the steady gait of a lawman but a small, folded brass key wrapped in oilcloth, found tucked in a boot at the livery among Amos Reed's few remaining things. Clara met him on the porch with hands still smelling faintly of hay and the same tightness in her chest that had followed her since the will had first unfurled its impossible claim. And there was a look in Eli's face that asked the kind of patience the law sometimes requires. He handed her the key as if it were a trust as much as a tool, and together they carried the trunk from its corner into the lamplight. The trunk was the sort that held secrets in old winters, scuffed leather, brass corners delved by travel, a lock that had resisted weather and time. And when Clara set the key in the cold metal, the act felt like turning a page in a book no one had dared to write. The tumblers clicked with a small, decisive music, and the lid rose to release a breath of dust and cedar-scented memory. Inside lay letters and bundles tied with faded ribbon, some yellowed to the color of late hay, others still soft and recent as if the ink had only just settled. There were also small things between the pages, a scrap of ribbon, a child's button, a pressed wildflower whose color had been bleached by the sun but retained the shape of something once dear. Clara's fingers trembled as she lifted the topmost letter, the script a lean, honest hand she had come to know from the journals, and she read first a series of apologies that made the cabin feel very small and very large all at once. Apologies to a woman named Eleanor that spoke in halting, aching phrases of mistakes made in the name of survival, of promises delayed until winters had changed in the voice that made them too late to be kept. The letters were not the polished contrition of a man seeking absolution before a judge. They were the raw, private confession of a man who had slept with regrets as his only blanket, each page a small, blunt doorway into the private geography of loss. There were also stories, tender, half-finished tales written as if for a child, a host of small adventures about a little girl named Rose who rode ponies that talked and chased moonbeams, who learned to braid the clouds into ribbons and to give her cheeks to the wind. The prose was simple and looping, the kind of voice that imagined safety into being, and Clara's throat tightened as she read how Amos had rehearsed joys he would never live to see his daughter hold. Interleaved with those stories were practical notes, recipes and tips about which fences to mend in spring and which pastures healed fastest after drought, and the whole file read like the instructions of a man attempting, with a pen, to hand over not only land but a way of loving it. The final note was folded more carefully than the rest. Its ink bled a little where perhaps wet eyes had paused, and its tone was both deliberate and surprisingly light, as if Amos wanted his last words to be a small comfort rather than a monumental burden. He wrote that he had seen death coming in the thinness of his breath and the way his hands halted over a pen, that he had chosen who should have the ranch not for profit or kinship but because he believed in the rare currency of a pure heart, the capacity to give without expecting return. Clara Boone, he had written, you fed a man when he needed little more than sustenance, and you did so without wetting what you would gain. In that act you proved more of a steward than any who counts land as ledger. If I go before I finish, let her finish what I could not. The words landed in Clara like a small, luminous stone dropped into still water, and she felt rings of feeling expand, shock, a new, fierce tenderness, and a grief for a man whose life had been braided tightly with regrets and good intentions. She read the letters again, slower, letting the cadence of Amos's voice settle into her bones, and the cabin seemed to fill with a presence that was not spectral but purposeful, as if the former owner's careful, imperfect love for this land had been waiting to be translated by someone patient enough to read it. Tears came then, sudden and hot, slipping down without announcement, and Sheriff Fila stood a respectful distance, his hat held to his chest, while Claire pressed the letters to her breast like relics of a faith she had not known she held. Responsibility no longer felt like an imposition but a mantle, heavy and honest, and in the silence that followed the trunk's opening she understood that Amos had not merely left her property. He had entrusted her with the daily, quiet work of mercy made real, tending fences, telling stories, righting wrongs, and safeguarding the memory of those who couldn't be saved. The fire began like a rumor, small at first, a smudge of orange along the ridge that might have been the sun's reflection on dry grass, but it grew with the speed of a lie once the wind caught it, a hungry tongue licking the parched scrub toward the reed boundary. Clara was at the barn mending a half-broken hitch when Tom Briggs shouted, and the world tightened into the immediate geometry of flame and smoke, the air gone sharp and tasting of iron. She ran with the others, hard hammering a rhythm that matched the shrill cry of a hawk above, grabbing buckets, dragging wet blankets, ordering horses away from the blaze with the clarity of someone whose life had been measured by necessity rather than grand designs. The sheriff arrived, hat low, face set in lines carved by duty, and for a terrible instant Clara felt the old panic, the one that had huddled her during those winters when bread was a memory, curl up in her chest and whisper that everything could be taken in a breath, fences, journals, the proof that a stranger had trusted her with a future. Fire does not care for fairness. It leaps. It finds tinder where hands fail to see it. And Claire tasted that recklessness in the air as she waded through heat with a soaked sack of sand and a resolution that surprised even her. She would not let Amos's trust burn under some man's resentment. Men fought the blaze with a focus that was bare and practical. They formed a line to pass buckets, to beat at embers with blankets, to cut fire bricks with axes that struck like meteoroids. The flames were clever and cruel, testing every seam of their resistance, and for a long hour the ridge seemed to live only in flame and the human bodies trying to deny it. Smoke filled Claire's lungs and made her cough until tears came unbidden, but she kept moving, kept handing off filled buckets, kept clamping a line where a fence threatened to surrender to heat. When the sheriff called for a halt and they paused to catch breath, the ridge had given up most of its fire songs, but the damage glowed in the blackened collars of grass and a section of fence charred into a sickle of ruin. In the quiet that followed the physical exhaustion, suspicion was as inevitable as ash. Eli's joy hardened as he said quietly that it smelled to him like an act, not a chance spark from lightning, but a deliberate hand. Rumors, which had once been a wind, now felt like embers flicked in the town's tinderbox. Jed Hale, who had spoken loudest against Clara, became the immediate focus of angry eyes. The town had watched him posture about ownership and rights, and motive is the kindling that always makes accusation burn bright. Jed met their looks with a sullen defiance, denying involvement and pointing instead to the town's wider resentments. But when a neighbor swore she had seen a figure riding away from the ridge the night before, cloaked and hurried, the circle of suspicion tightened. Clara felt a cold that was not from smoke settled in her bones, the old temptation to meet intimidation with violence, to take justice into her own hands and drive iron into the throat of the man she suspected, was a voice that rose like thirst in a dry season. But in the char and heat she also felt Amos's careful pen in the margins of his letters, the man who had chosen trust over calculation, and Clara's hands, black with soot, shook not only with fatigue but with determination to do the harder thing, insist on law. "We won't trade our morals for revenge," she told the sheriff, voice raw, meeting his eyes with the steadiness she had built in small measures over weeks of mending and reading. Eli nodded, knowing as she did that vengeance would only widen wounds and that a fair inquiry, slow, messy, and painful, was the only road to right. So the sheriff set about gathering witnesses and tracking the origins of the flame with the dull, patient work of someone who knows the truth often hides under debris. Clara stood among neighbors, hands open and stained, feeling the split between the part of her that wanted immediate retribution and the part that understood stewardship meant patience, dignity, and an unwillingness to let the frontier's rough justice become a lie. In that charged silence she learned something vital. Tending a ranch was not only rebuilding fence rails after a storm but rebuilding trust after violence, keeping promises even when the world offered payback as a tempting shortcut, and protecting the fragile human investment Amos had made in her by refusing to answer heat with fire. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. Clara waited until nightfall to open the last of Amos's journals, sensing, without needing a reason, that whatever waited in those remaining pages required a silence untouched by chores, by neighbors' suspicions, by the lingering smell of smoke on her clothes. She lit a single lamp, its circle of light small but steady, and sat in the rocking chair he had worn smooth, the wood sighing under her weight as if remembering its former companion. The journal was thinner than the others, its cover softened by many revisits, and when she opened to the first to the final entries, the handwriting struck her at once as more fragile, the letters slanting slightly, as though Amos had been fighting the tremor in his hands or the slow weakening of his breath. He wrote of wandering the edges of dust wood with pockets empty and pride thinner still, of watching townsfolk cross the road to avoid him, mothers pulling children close when his shadow stretched too near, men in saloons refusing him a glance unless it came with suspicion. His words were not bitter, only tired, carved out of the constant sting of being looked at as something less than a man, as if his ragged coat and hollow cheeks carried a contingent of ruin. Clara felt her throat tighten as she read how he slept in abandoned sheds, in the lee side of barns, in the dusty corners of places where no one else bothered to look. Yet scattered between the lines was a gentleness she hadn't expected. He wrote about observing kindness from afar, small mercies exchanged between neighbors, a father teaching his son to ride, a woman leaving a pail of water for strangers. He wrote as if those brief glimpses anchored him against the loneliness the frontier carved into him day by day. And then came the entry dated just a week before his death, its words clearer, more deliberate, as though he had summoned every last drop of strength to set his truth down with precision. Amos recalled the night he staggered to Clara's door, starving to the marrow, expecting once again the familiar recoil, the wary glance, the dismissal. Instead, he wrote, he saw a pair of weary but steady eyes meet his without flinching, without calculation. She didn't see a dying man, he wrote. She saw a human soul. Clara pressed her fingers to her lips, breath caught in a trembling pause as she traced the ink. How could a single crust of bread, given from her own desperation, have reached him so deeply? Amos continued, revealing the thoughts that had knotted inside him for years, guilt over Eleanor and Rose, shame for the life he failed to protect, and the way those regrets had shadowed every mile until he no longer believed he deserved compassion from anyone. But when Clara placed that crust in his hands, he said, something inside him loosened. An old, rusted hinge of hope creaked open, not wide, not boldly, but enough that he felt life offer him one final choice. And that choice, he wrote painstakingly, was not about repayment but about legacy. He explained that he had watched her in town before, had noticed the way she carried her grief without bitterness, the way she worked quietly, the way she did not raise her voice when the world pressed too hard. He believed, in his last days, that Clara Boone was the one person who would not turn his land into profit or revenge. I leave her my ranch, the entry concluded, not because she earned it, but because she gave freely. Let the land rest with a heart that knows hunger, mercy, and the worth of a small kindness. Clara's eyes stung as she closed the journal, the weight of Amos's gratitude settling around her like a mantle woven from both sorrow and grace. She felt uplifted, seen in a way she had never expected, and yet the burden of it pressed just as deeply. For now she knew the ranch was not a gift but a trust handed to her through a man's last trembling hope. In the lamp's glow, she let the tears fall, not only for Amos Reed and all he lost, but for the strange, tender truth that a single act of compassion had now braided their fates together in ways neither could have imagined. The day-dead hail was brought before Sheriff Eli's quiet, sunlit office. The whole town seemed to wait at its edges, as if the confession would be a bell that told what everyone already feared but had whispered around the edges of cups and fences. Yet's face was harder than ever, lines carved by scowls and long winters, and when the sheriff asked him to tell the truth, it came out not as a neat story of blame but as a ragged confession that stripped the bright edges from his accusations. He said he had not set the fire, that he had been in his own barn that night, restless and nursing a grudge of a man who counts years by cattle and measures worth by how many fences he can claim. But he admitted the thing that had driven his voice loud in saloons and meetings. He had once worked for Amos Reed, years back when Amos was a man with little more than a handshake and a stubborn will. Yet's hands clenched as he spoke, the confession tumbling out in fits and starts, and he told how he had watched Amos rebuild a life from nothing, how the stranger's steady labor and careful tending had raised him from a transient to a man with a ranch that held sunrises and fences and the kind of quiet dignity Judd ached for. I worked for him, Judd said, voice low, and I watched him take what used to be mine and make it his. I wanted it, wanted the name, the land, God forgive me. I wanted it so bad I chewed my tongue till it bled. The room grew still in the way that only truth can make a place hold its breath. Jet's confession wasn't the clean, satisfying confession of an arsonist seeking redemption but the raw, awful naming of envy. He spoke of small cruelties, how he spurned Amos in town, how he added whispers to a chorus of suspicion, how he let jealousy harden into a claim that sounded like justice but reeked of entitlement. The sheriff listened without show, as a man tasked with weighing human frailty against the law. And when he asked why Jet had pushed so hard, the farmer's answer was simple and terrible. Because a man like him shouldn't have more than I do, he said, and his eyes were not proud but empty. For the townsfolk who crowded outside, Jet's words felt like a mirror held to each uneasy face. Envy, they saw, was the subterranean current that had been staining their conversations and poisoning neighborly regard long before any fire had started. When evidence finally cleared Jet of the blaze he had feared might be pinned to him, his confession remained, an admission of a spiritual crime as much as any legal one. He had let bitterness corrode his better self. Clara heard him and felt something shift inside, a complex knot of anger, pity, and the stubborn moral muscle she had been growing since Amos's name arrived in ink. The law could have punished Jed for slander, for intimidation, for the careless acts that had left a fence rail gone and a field scarred. Men in the back muttered for justice in the old, hard way, and a few hands reached for the iron of retribution as if settling scores were a straightforward arithmetic. But Clara remembered the journals, Amos's tender, ragged notes about failing to save those he loved and the strange, fragile mercy he had offered her when she fed him without expectation. She had felt Amos's choice like a charge then, a request, perhaps, to steward not only his land but his ethics. So when the sheriff turned to her and asked, quietly, what she intended to do, Clara surprised even herself by saying, simply, no charges. The room seemed to tilt, mouths opened, and Jed's own face shifted into something like disbelief. I won't press him, she said, voice steady as a rope pulled taut against the wind. I won't see a life destroyed for the sake of settling a mean heart. Mercy in Dustwood was not cheap. It cost more than retaliatory satisfaction and required the town to look at its own faults. Some called her saintly, others foolish, but most watched as she walked out of the sheriff's office with the same small, stubborn dignity she'd shown when she offered her crust of bread. Jed stood a while longer, the admission laid bare for him to see like the innards of a machine, and then he went back to his land, smaller somehow, the shape of his envy now visible to him like a wound he couldn't easily hide. In the days that followed, the town's tensions eased not because grievances had vanished, but because Clara's refusal to answer hatred with hatred forced people to consider a different economy, one where forgiveness and stewardship might be worth more than a quick settling of accounts. The confession in Clara's merciful response rewired Dustwood's moral wiring a degree. Folks who had cheered Judd now caught themselves apologizing when they met her at the well. And those who had doubted Amos's judgment felt the weight of a man's last choice settle into an ordinary, human honesty. Clara's mercy did not erase the past, nor did it dissolve Judd's resentment overnight, but it marked a turning point. The town could choose to let envy fester into violence or to be better stewards of neighborliness, and for the first time since the will arrived there was a sense that the ranch might be a place where wounds could be tended rather than weapons chosen. Clara rose before dawn on a morning washed in pale rose light, the kind that makes the world look soften at its edges, as if offering a second beginning rather than another weary continuation. For the first time since inheriting the Reed Ranch, she did not feel like an intruder in someone else's unfinished story, but like a steward stepping quietly, firmly into her own. She walked the property line with a bucket of nails and a hammer hooked at her belt, her boots stirring the dew from the grass, and as she inspected each fence post she felt a curious steadiness settle inside her. Not confidence exactly, but a kind of earned belonging that came from surviving storms, threats, and the revelation of a man's deepest wounds written in trembling ink. At the barn she paused, listening to the soft shuffle of the horses and the slow creak of old timbers, and then she set to work, pulling down the rotted planks and replacing them with boards Tom Briggs had delivered at cost, the wood smelling of fresh sawdust and promise. It was hard work, sweat stinging and repetitive, but every swing of the hammer felt like stitching a seam torn long ago. She found a rhythm in the effort, a piece she hadn't known she'd missed. Later, she cleared a patch of earth near the cabin and planted a small garden, beans, turnips, a few stubborn tomato starts offered by Mrs. Keene with quiet pride, and as she pressed the seeds into the soil she whispered a small, private prayer that they might take root in land that had seen too much grief and too many lonely seasons. Her fingers, still rough from repairing fences, moved gently through the earth, and she found herself smiling at how symbolic the act felt, rebuilding, replanting, reclaiming not only the ranch but a piece of herself long dormant beneath fear and hunger. Word of her work spread faster than she expected, and by the end of that week neighbors began appearing unannounced, not with pity but with purpose. Tom returned with tools and a silent nod that said he respected her choices more than he cared to say aloud. A pair of teenagers from town arrived to clear brush along the creek bed, their laughter echoing across the property. Even Martha Keene came tapping stubbornly against the ground, brought a basket of cuttings from her own garden, insisting they would brighten the place the way Amos always meant it to be. Each small act of help felt like a stitch binding her to the community that had once eyed her with suspicion, and Clara's heart swelled with a warmth she had thought hunger and grief had long since starved out of her. In the evenings, After the tools were cleaned and the sun melted behind the far ridge in golden violet ribbons, Clara would sit on the porch and listen to the wind sweep across the fields, the tall grass whispering against itself like soft conversation. In those moments she felt Amos not as a haunting presence but as a gentle encouragement, a steadying warmth in the breeze, a quiet reminder woven into the rustle of the leaves. She imagined him walking the perimeter just as she had, hat tipped low, hands in his pockets, humming some tune he never wrote down. She didn't feel watched, she felt accompanied. The ranch no longer felt like a burden dropped suddenly into her lap for a living, breathing place eager to be tended, restored, and understood. Even the carved initials in the barn, AR+ER, felt less like a grief carved into wood and more like a humble monument to love lost and remembered. She touched them each morning as she passed, not to stir sorrow but to honor the man who had trusted her with the remnants of his life. And as she looked out over the fields Amos once walked, the same fields now beginning to show signs of new life under her care, Clara Boone understood something profound. This land, this inheritance, was not about ownership at all. It was about healing what had been broken, carrying forward what had been nearly forgotten, and allowing kindness, once planted in desperation, to bloom into a legacy. Clara rose long before dawn on the morning of the memorial ride, the sky still a deep indigo whispering of the sun it had yet to reveal. And for a moment she stood on the porch with her hand resting on the railing, breathing in the silence that felt both sacred and expectant. She had spread word through Dustwood over the past week that she meant to honor Amos Reed with a sunrise gathering, not a funeral nor a sermon, but a ride across the land he had shaped with his hands in quiet endurance. And to her surprise nearly 24 townsfolk answered, ranchers, schoolchildren, widows, riders young and old, each arriving in the first shreds of graylight with reins in hand and an unspoken readiness to settle something long overdue. Horses snorted soft clouds into the chill air as the riders mounted up, and Clara, sitting tall on Amos's old sorrel mare, felt a warmth rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the wool draped around her shoulders. It felt like belonging, like carrying a torch across darkness. Tom Briggs rode at her right, dipping his hat, while Martha Keene, stubborn as ever, rode in a wagon pulled by 2 patient geldings, her shawl wrapped tightly as if the morning air were a truth she intended to face head-on. When Clara gave the gentle signal, the group set off in a slow, deliberate line that wound across the property like a procession of shadows traveling toward light. The hoof beats formed a quiet rhythm, steady as a heartbeat, and the closer they came to the ridge, the more the sky softened into hues of pale rose and trembling gold, each new color spilling gently across the land Amos had once walked alone. At the ridge crest, they halted, horses shifting softly at the edge of the valley that stretched wide and shimmering below, a valley that looked, in that moment, like a great bull ready to catch the first blessing of morning. Clara dismounted, her boots sinking into the cool earth, and for a few breaths she simply let the wind move through her hair, carrying with it the faint sense of sage and turned soil. Then she turned to the waiting circle of riders and felt the weight of their attention settle gently, not as pressure but as trust. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low but steady, shaped by grief, gratitude, and the long road she had walked since the night she gave a starving stranger her last crust of bread. Amos taught me something I didn't know I was hungry for, she said, pausing as a gust of wind tugged at her coat like an unseen hand. He taught me that kindness is the last currency the frontier kept corrupt. Land changes hands. Fortunes rise and fall, but the way we treat one another, that's the only legacy that outlives us. Her words drifted across the ridge like embers carried gently on the wind, and the riders bowed their heads as the sun finally crested the far horizon, spilling gold across the valley in a single sweeping gesture that felt almost like a benediction. Horses turned their ears toward the light, and for one fleeting moment the world seemed to exhale, a cinematic stillness where dust motes hung suspended like stars caught between day and night. Clara closed her eyes, feeling Amos's presence not as a ghost but as a quiet, steady encouragement riding the wind that brushed her cheek. She felt him in the warmth of the sunlight, in the steady breath of the mare beneath her hand, in the hushed unity of the gathered townsfolk whose hearts, for this brief moment, beat in the same soft rhythm. When she finally looked out across the land, its golden sweep glowing with promise, she felt not the weight of inheritance but the gift of it, an unfinished story now carried forward by many hands, guided by the simple truth that kindness, once offered freely, could light even the darkest corners of the frontier. Clara stood at the ranch gate in the tender hush that follows a long night, the horizon just beginning to unfurl its pale gold ribbon across the fields. Amos once walked with the patience of a man who had learned to treasure every quiet dawn. The air smelled of dew and sage, the kind of clean coolness that sinks straight into the heart, and as she rested her hands on the weathered wood, she felt its grain beneath her palms like the pulse of all that had come before: loss, labor, grace, and the strange, humbling gift of an inheritance she had never sought. The memorial ride had ended hours earlier, but its echo lingered inside her. The soft thud of hooves, the murmured prayers, the wind-threaded whispers of neighbors who had finally come to see Amos Reed not as a drifter but as a man who had carried love and regret in equal measure. Clara breathed deeply, letting the sunrise warm her cheeks, and felt the gentle stir of something more than memory. She felt Amos's presence not in the haunted sense of a ghost but in the grounded way a man's kindness continues long after his body fails, woven into soil, fences, journals, and the simple steadiness of the woman who had chosen to honor his trust. She let her gaze stretch across the prairie, watching the light catch on the early shimmer of wild grass, each blade bending like a congregation bowing to a greater truth, and she wondered, as she had wondered every day since that crust of bread left her hand, whether there was still space in the world for small mercies, for acts so humble they seemed invisible until they changed everything. Life had not grown gentler. They still whispered in town, still argued over land and pride, still carried envy like a quiet ache. But Clara had learned that harshness and grace were not opposites so much as neighbors sharing the same long fence line, and a person's choices determined which one stepped across. She thought of her younger self, cold and hungry, clutching that last crust as if it were the final coin in a dwindling purse. She thought of Amos, trembling at her door with the weight of a life shaped by losses no man should bear alone, and how something passed between them in that moment, something wordless, pure, unmeasured by any ledger. The world had tried to take much from her, but that night it had given her something back: a purpose, a place, a story intertwined with another's sorrow and redemption. The sun rose fully now, striking the prairie in a wash of gold so bright it felt like a promise, and Clara spoke softly into the morning air, her voice steady but threaded with the tender ache of all she had lived. "If a crust of bread could change my whole life," she murmured, as though speaking to Amos, to herself, and to anyone who might one day hear her tale, "what small mercy might change yours?" The words drifted outward, lifted by the wind that carried them across the grazing fields, across the repaired fences, across the valley where shadows fled before the sun. Clara stood there long after the light had fully claimed the day, letting the warmth settle into her bones, knowing that life would still test her, that the frontier would always be both sharp and beautiful, but also knowing that she had found something worthy to hold, the belief that kindness, even offered in hunger, could ripple outward and change the shape of a life. And as the prairie glowed around her like the first page of a new chapter, Clara Boone felt the quiet, enduring truth of the land she now called home. Hope, like sunrise, always returns. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.